Hello and welcome to today's OneOp webinar. I am Kaylin Goebel and I am the Program Development Specialist for OneOp. I will be moderating today's session and thank you for joining us today for bullying as a developmental precursor to sexual and dating violence across adolescence. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a brief tour of our webinar platform so that you can find your way around today. Hopefully, you are currently able to view the slides we're sharing. If you can't see them or are having any other difficulties, please email us at contact@oneop.org for tech support. We hope that you join us today to engage in the chat pod. To embed the chat so you don't miss any links or conversations, simply place your cursor over the shared slides. You should then see a toolbar pop up across the bottom of your screen, and from there, just click the chat bubble icon. When typing any comments or questions today, please make sure that you have everyone selected from the drop-down menu so that everyone attending can view your comments and your contributions to the chat pod. Slides and resources are available for download on the webinar event page, and I will be covering continuing education information at the end of the webinar today. So please stay tuned until the very end of the session if you're hoping to obtain those CE credits or wish to receive a certificate of attendance for those instructions. Finally, closed captioning is available for this webinar. You can turn on the subtitles via the Zoom toolbar in that bottom pop-up options. We thank you so much for joining us today as we continue our partnership with the Department of Defense and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to expand the readiness, knowledge, and networks of professionals like yourself supporting our military service members and their families. For today's session, we are joined again by Dr. Dorothy Espelage. Dr. Espelage is a William C. Friday Distinguished Professor of Education at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is the recipient of the APA Lifetime Achievement Award in Prevention Science and of 2016 APA Award for Distinguished Contributions to Research and Public Policy, and is a fellow of APS, APA, and AERA. She is also an elected member of the National Academy of Education and was awarded the SPR Prevention Science Award in 2020, and in 2023 received the Bully Research Network Outstanding Career Award. Over the last 25 years, she has authored extensive work around bullying, homophobic teasing, sexual harassment, dating violence, social emotional learning interventions, and school climate. Her research focuses on translating empirical findings into prevention and intervention programming, and we are very happy to have her today to continue the conversation around prevention of these problematic behaviors in our children and youth. Before I hand things over, just a few quick reminders that a recording of this presentation will be available on the webinar event page for on-demand viewing. Please give us about 24 to 48 hours after today's conclusion to have that up, but you can visit the event page if you need to revisit the session today or step away for any reason. That recording will be available to you. And one more reminder that you can download a presentation PDF handout, as well as a list of the resources that Dr. Espelage will be mentioning today on the event page. And CE information, I will cover that at the end of today's session for any folks hoping to get continuing education hours. And with that, I am happy to turn things over to Dr. Espelage for you to begin.
Great, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending this second presentation that I was able to give. Excited to share more of our research and our intervention approaches. The previous webinar that I did last month was called Building a Safer Future, Insights on Youth Violence and Bullying Prevention. And I encourage you, when you have time, to view that. So today I'm going to talk about a particular part of our research program and give you a sense of the connection between those kids that are involved in bullying and how that is related to sexual and teen dating violence across adolescence. Our research has been heavily funded by Centers for Disease Control, NIJ, NSF, NIH, and therefore the disclaimer is anything that I say here is actually my opinion and not those of the federal government. So in the next hour and 15 minutes, we're going to cover quite a plethora of research, but really with three objectives. First, hopefully by the end of this time together, you'll understand the research on youth bullying as a precursor to adolescent sexual violence and teen dating violence. I'm hopeful that you'll understand and recognize the risk and protective factors that interventions need to address if we're going to dismantle that link between bullying, sexual violence, and later teen dating violence. Certainly, we don't have time to talk about all the potential evidence-based programs, but I will hit one particular program that's been in the work for decades that's shown really great promise in reducing these forms of violence. And I apologize if my voice is a little off. I'm still continuing to get over a cold or a flu, so I apologize. So in the chat, be looking at your responses. So you have lots of things that you can do in a day, certainly lots of continuing ed credits. So why did you prioritize attending this webinar on this very specific topic of bullying and sexual violence? I'll just give you a few seconds just to jot that down, and I'll be watching that. And maybe you didn't think about it. Maybe you just, this was a good time, further education. Thank you, Rita. And hopefully your mind will be open and you'll learn something about this connection. And who doesn't love free CEUs? I love that, Stacy. Thank you. Always speaking truth. Yes, so certainly going to talk to, it seems to be a negative trend. Unfortunately, that's true. It's great to see the U.S. Air Force here. Myself, I'm a Navy military child, so it is very awesome to be here talking to you and giving you some information that might be helpful. Yes, go Navy. Yes, that was Virginia and Norfolk where I grew up. So this is like a dream come true to be able to take 28 years of research and talk to you about it in the next hour. Okay, thank you so much. We got some interactivity. Yes, high school students, we're going to learn about that. And so we're going to talk about bullying, sexual violence, also called sexual harassment in the middle school and high school context. And then we're going to talk about teen dating violence, also called adolescent relationship aggression, or ARA. I'll try to use the same terminology throughout. So when we think about the children and the families that you work with, let's talk specifically about the children. We really do, when we try to understand the connection between bullying and other concomitant forms of aggression and violence, try to understand that unique child is embedded within a unique family situation. And I would say even within the military subculture, I like to call it one of the best subcultures in the world, just being in the military and being military connected brings a whole host of really challenges, the transitions, the deployments, the new schools, dual deployment, those types of things, but also brings resilience as well, right? So strength-based approach to understanding these families. But sometimes kids engage in these problematic behaviors such as bullying or sexual violence as a result of the stress that they might be experiencing within the family. So don't necessarily pathologize that problematic behavior, but understanding that in some cases it might work for the child in that particular new school, for example. But for us to understand these problematic behaviors, we have to understand not just only that family stress, but what is the school like? Is the school really on top of their bullying situation? Are they Title IX compliant? So they're actually talking to kids and doing their job around sexual harassment, or are they not? We'll see differences when we start talking about those risk factors at the school level. Does the new child, like myself at Plaza Junior High in Virginia Beach, when I was the new child put in the front of the room and say, we have a new student today, it's Dorothy yet again. Which peer group did I join? Did I join a group that where the problematic behaviors are the norm? Or did I join a group where pro-social behaviors are the norm? That predicts the extent to which I might engage in these problematic behaviors we're talking about today. We also have to think about the larger community, right? So if I'm centered in, say, an after-school program as a military-connected kid, has the norm become such that that problematic behavior is tolerated, ignored, or is it a pro-social community space? And then generally thinking about many of our children and their behaviors are influenced by the messaging they hear generally in society, on TV, exposure to social media, those types of things. So it's complex to understand the problematic behavior, but we don't situate the problematic behavior just within the child, but understanding that there's risk and protective factors in all of these other nested spaces. So in addition to the socio-ecological perspective as this overarching framework, as I said, we often look to either a place that might maintain these problematic behaviors, but they also mitigate them as well. You could have schools that have a very strong anti-bullying prevention program and policies and practices in connection with families. You can also have schools where it's kind of chaotic and it's a negative school climate such that the chaos may lead to increases in these problematic behaviors among youth. We also know that peers are a huge influence during adolescence, and we know that birds of a feather flock together. So if your child is new to a school and they join a group that engages in these problematic behaviors, unfortunately, we know that over time, that child, which may have not displayed those problematic behaviors, may begin engaging in those types of bullying or sexual harassment because that is what the peers do. We also recognize that familial contexts matter. In some of our studies, which I'll show, relates to the social interactional learning model, that sometimes our kids in our studies and our prevention approaches are witnessing violence in the home. One of the number one predictors of bullying involvement is actually being a victim of sibling aggression, which we tend to see as a proxy for larger family violence that might be happening within the context. And so family violence, not all kids that engage in high rates of bullying or sexual harassment are exposed to family violence, but it is a strong predictor of those behaviors. We also recognize that, and we'll talk more about this, simply having anger management issues, being unregulated can be predictive of involvement in bullying and sexual harassment. We know the onset of alcohol use also is implicated in these behaviors. And because there are youth that may have parents, both parents might be deployed, or one might be deployed and the other is working several jobs, that there's a tendency to be unmonitored or unsupervised. And so that then introduces potentially those youth joining youth that are engaging in high rates of delinquency or problematic behavior in that way. And that could be related to the escalation of bullying involvement to sexual harassment and then subsequently teen dating violence. We also, as you'll hear, understand the connection between bullying and sexual harassment to be kind of grounded within gendered harassment. Oftentimes when you hear homophobic slurs, it is a way to minimize and if you of one gender over the other. And oftentimes some forms of this problematic behavior may emerge as kids adopt this idea that boys should be stoic, be emotionally restrictive, be competitive and aggressive. So that could be driving some of this as well. But we're going to unpack that as best we can in the next hour. But those are the theoretical frameworks that we have, almost the biases, if you will, that I bring to the table. I want to spend the next few minutes defining things because I think if you're not living in this research like myself for 30 years, what feels like 24 hours, 7 days a week. It's hard to know exactly how we're defining things. So bullying is an unwanted aggressive behavior among school-aged children that has a high likelihood of causing physical or psychological harm or injury. Now, it's different than one-off conflicts that kids might have with their friends or other peers within the school context, in that there is an imbalance of real or perceived power that favors the person engaging in these problematic behaviors. And that power can manifest itself in many ways. It could be the size of the individual being larger, in some ways taller. It could be popularity or high social status could afford them engagement in this problematic behavior. It could be that your parents have more money than the victim, if you will. And so that power, it could be athletic prowess. It could be, again, like I said, popularity, which is very common among adolescents to predict this problematic behavior. However, it's also different than the one-off conflict in that it's likely to be repeated. And we used to say it has to be repeated, but we also know that kids that are targets of this problematic behavior of bullying often change their behavior. And so if you watch my first webinar, we would unpack that throughout the webinar. But here, just to say, when kids are targeted by this problematic behavior, they change their behavior to reduce the likelihood that it would happen again. Parents will drive their child to school because there might have been some victimization or bullying that was happening on the school bus. Kids have been known to not take lunch in the cafeteria, but do that in a bathroom stall. Kids also, unfortunately, if the bullying is happening in sport, will drop out of sport, which should break all of our hearts because we know sport is so protective. So also understanding that sometimes kids may tell different adults, and if the adults are not communicating with one another about what the child is experiencing, they may not see the repetition. A great example is oftentimes kids that are targeted with this problematic behavior will go to a school nurse with the attempt to try to be sent home for being sick. And oftentimes it's repeated visits to the nurse. So it could also be that there's an SRO or a school police officer that has seen some of these problematic behaviors. We would want that SRO, for example, to be able to talk to the nurse. So bullying prevention really is about communication among the adults. What we do know is those kids that are targeted through bullying, leads to long-term feelings of being intimidated, demeaned, and humiliated, which then is associated through adulthood with major depression and major anxiety for those kids that are targeted. So again, when we're thinking about the concept of bullying, I want you to think about this power differential, something that's repeated and something that really gets under the skin of those kids that are targeted. Now, when we think about the definition of sexual harassment and violence, so we're going to think about the umbrella of sexual violence. So sexual violence refers to any sexual act, verbal or physical, that one or more individuals enacts against another who does not or cannot freely consent. Sexual violence is harmful behavior exhibited by and against adolescents all over the world, right? So this definition comes from Centers for Disease Control. It also comes from our Title IX federal legislation. Examples of sexual violence include harassing remarks about one body or what one would do with the body in a sexual way, sharing nude or intimate photos of someone without their consent, sexual threats, and unwanted forced or coerced sexual contact or rape. Now, under that umbrella is sexual harassment, and sexual harassment is that unwanted verbal commentary, again, about one's body or what you would do with one's body. Under sexual harassment, homophobic teasing or taunting is a form of both sexual harassment as sexual violence. It's intended to call attention to a queer or perceived queer sexual orientation in a pejorative way that asserts that heteronormativity and thus the dominance for those nearby to witness. Now, I do want to say that when youth use homophobic epithets directed toward others, whether that's GAY or FAG, that's done to send a message that particular sexual orientation, again, it's in a pejorative way, is not accepted within that culture and that context. That said, we also find in our work that a lot of this homophobic, some people will call it bantering, does happen among friends. But do not be confused. When we talk to youth where they are called those names by their friends, it is still harmful, it is hurtful, it is associated with depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts over time for some youth. And so this isn't just that, in some ways, the youth find it much more harmful when it's coming from their supposed friends that care for them. So remembering again to not dismiss this language as just bantering, which is often the way it's described, but understand that there is real harm to be done when friends are engaging these behaviors, and certainly those of strangers as well. Now, we have to understand that sexual harassment and sexual violence is not uncommon. And so there was a research done in 2014 of 27 European countries, and the lifetime prevalence rate of sexual violence victimization involving females, excluding childhood sexual abuse, ranged from 9 to 83%. And there's a wide range depending on just the type, the country, their tolerance for this type of behavior. In some countries, it's more normative than it is here, unfortunately. And the rates for males range from 2 to 66%. When we look in North America, 20% of physical adolescent dating violence and 9% of sexual adolescent dating violence emerges when we look at closer into North America. So again, when we look at the dating relationship, that is sexual component, it's 9%. Ybarra and Mitchell's, this is in the United States, which is a nationally representative sample in 2013, indicated that nearly 1 in 10 adolescents nationwide had reported experiences of some type of sexual violence in the last year, right? So 1 out of 10, 10% in the last year, where the other numbers I've shown lifetime prevalence. We also then had this 2014 study, and you're probably thinking these are out of date. It's a challenge now to measure these phenomenon with the parents' rights legislation and other things that are happening. So unfortunately, some of the studies I'm going to show you that we've done recently are kind of in that same range of 2013 to 17. But the Decker of 2014 comprised a sample of 15 to 19-year-olds in 5 countries. So imagine the countries of United States, India, Nigeria, South Africa, and China. And they reported the prevalence to range within the last year from 10% in China to 36% in South Africa, which we know in South Africa it might be related to large class sizes, so difficulty for teachers to manage 50 and 60 students in a classroom. So you can imagine that sexual harassment and inappropriate touching might emerge in that context. So when we think about teen dating violence, this could be physical, verbal, or psychological control. It could also be stalking. We're not going to talk too much about stalking. It's not as prevalent as the other forms. Like sexual violence, identity and social context are critical data points. So we know that sexual violence and teen dating violence also affects different types of identity, and I'll give you a glimpse into that. This Witcheck 2017 meta-analysis study found that about 20% of teens experience violence in a romantic relationship lifetime, and about 9% experience sexual forms of teen dating violence. So here we're saying that 1 out of 5 teens have experienced some type of violence within their romantic relationship. So it's not an insignificant prevalence. I wanted to show you this, that we were able to collect some data in Dane County, Wisconsin, where they are still asking sexual orientation questions. So we're able to get a sample of lesbian, gay, and bisexual questioning youth, 761. And then we had 11,000 that were straight identified or non-LGBTQ. And what we find is that the teen dating violence rates are double for the LGBTQ versus the non-LGBTQ. So we want to make sure that you understand that the higher rate, and oftentimes people will say, well, why is that, Dorothy? And the research, especially qualitative research, actually talking to LGBTQ youth about the relationships and why there would be violence, has uncovered some hypotheses, actually really data, showing that sometimes these kids will stay in abusive relationships because they might be living in a community where they see that there's no one else that they could possibly date. It could be also their own internalized, what we call internalized homophobia. It may be that they're in this relationship, but their parents don't know, the community don't know. So that secrecy, they may actually, feel bad about that. And so that could cause some distress. And then generally just being in a relationship that might not be supported or seen by community as the community as being affirming can lead to them staying in these relationships over time. We find very similar and actually higher rates for this 197 youth that are 7th through 12th graders in Dane County that is identified as transgender. And again, we have to think about why are they staying in these abusive relationships and what types of strategies, which we'll refer to some webinars that you can refer to as you unpack the relationship between teen dating violence among different sexual and gender minority youth. Okay, I wanted to show you that there's real implications for this in the same data set. I'll unpack this. What I have plotted here is the rates of suicidality among the youth grades 7 through 12, again in Dane County, Wisconsin. So you have to take it as a grain of salt there that it's Dane County. But what I'm plotting here is the blue line are the LGBTQ youth, and the orange line are those that do not identify as LGBTQ. I want you to pay close attention to the blue line on the left. That blue line are those LGBTQ youth that are in dating violent relationships, right? They have the highest suicidality. Now you take the orange on the left, those kids that do not identify as a gender or sexual minority youth, but they're still in a violent dating relationship, their suicidality is lower. So really, we want to pay attention to when you are working with a gender and sexual minority youth that is reporting high rates of teen dating violence to you, be very concerned about suicidality, do a suicidality assessment, have a suicidal plan. And many of you are clinicians, you know to do this, but do not trivialize this relationship because ideally we want them to be on the right side with the lowest rates of suicidality. And as you can see, that blue on the right side, if I identify as a gender and sexual minority youth, but I am not experiencing violence in my relationships, that my dating relationships, the suicidality would be low. So remember that although they identify as gender and sexual minority youth, they also need to have the same conversations about healthy relationships, healthy dating relationships as other youth are afforded. Unfortunately, what we do know is most of the teen dating violence prevention programs that are out there do not necessarily discuss anything beyond heterosexual relationships. And so that's something that we need to continue to work on, which is a challenge in the climate that we are experiencing across the country. Okay, so I have spent most of my career really trying to understand the risk and protective factors of bullying. But more specifically, when we started to talk to youth in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, we started to develop this model of bullying, sexual harassment, and dating violence. So really, this research and these research questions and studies emerged from the voice of the youth that we were sitting across from, again, as I said, in the late 1990s and 2000s. This has culminated into decades of research over time. And this is the full model. We're not going to have time to unpack all of this, but we have found that in our communities and our families and our youth, that child abuse and domestic violence is associated with sibling aggression. This kind of this focus here of family violence and exposure to domestic violence and even experiencing child abuse is associated with anger management issues among youth, drug and alcohol use or onset of use, delinquency. And it's also all three of these are so associated with bullying involvement and problematic behaviors associated with bullying. I'm going to demonstrate in the next half hour or so that this problematic behavior related to bullying is associated with greater risk for engagement in sexual harassment and sexual violence, which is then what we call a mediator or also a precursor to teen dating violence over time. Yeah, so Lisa asked the question, can you say more about the different information an LGBTQ youth would need to receive about healthy relationships than a heterosexual youth? I don't think it's not necessarily different information. It's because I think that those, yeah, like the motivation behind it. I don't think the actual content would be different, but it would be lovely. We know that if their type of relationship is represented. So for example, most of the prevention materials will always be talking about a boy dating a girl dating a boy. Well, we know that for youth to resonate with our prevention messaging, they need to see themselves in those prevention messaging. And so just having, girl dating a girl, boy dating a boy itself would have greater engagement. But I think your point is well taken that most of the risk and protective factors that I'm going to talk about to prevent these problematic behaviors would be similar between the two. Now, if you were in a progressive school district where one, you could even have I guess an LGBT or gender and sexual minority relationship represented, which would be a hurdle for many of you, then you could go into discussions around internalized homophobia. But generally, so that's a complicated answer to a pretty simple question that the reality is it's healthy relationships. Conversation look the same. To engage those gender and sexual minority youth, it would be nice if they see their actual relationship represented in your vignettes or your materials. Okay, so for the thank you, Lisa. Yeah, so for this conversation, we're going to hone in on this right side here of really unpacking this problematic behavior trajectory from bullying to teen dating violence. I also just want to all of us have like a reality check that as much as it sounds like I'm being innovative with my bullying, the sexual violence to teen dating violence pathway, there were folks that came before me. And this is Nan Stein's work. She's out of Wellesley. She was a mentor of mine for years in my early career. She was seeing the connection of really understanding that in order to prevent dating abuse, we had to reduce the social acceptance of bullying and sexual harassment. This curriculum, Bully Proof, was written in 1996, right? So that was 28 years ago. And so at that point, they were starting to see in case law and other examples of some basic research that there was a connection here. And so that was 1997 to 2000. So here we are thinking that this is innovative when in fact we've seen this connection for many decades. And this particular intervention did a lot of the things that we're going to suggest throughout this webinar, and that is a classroom curriculum to talk to kids about the difference between, in this case, they did flirting and hurting, staff training around Title IX and their obligation to address sexual harassment, to not only prevent it, but intervene when it happens and prevent retaliation. developing policies at the schools such that students and parents understand sexual harassment policies and how it's going to be handled, parent education, and then support services for those that are targets of this problematic behavior, and also for those kids that are engaging in the problematic behavior. So again, I just want to make it clear that this is something that has been around, and we have virtually did very little in moving the needle and really preventing these outcomes, unfortunately. I also want to take you down a journey, which is, again, looking in the Espelage, that's me, rear view mirror, but also thinking about how we've come to this state of 2024, where we're seeing some of the highest rates of sexual violence, sexual harassment, and we would argue post-pandemic, some of the highest rates of the problematic behavior of bullying. So in 1997, 98, and I'll go through this pretty quickly, we have to cover a lot of information, but we were sitting down and talking to middle school kids and high school kids around bullying, because at that point, there were only 3 papers written in the United States on the topic of bullying. And most of what we knew was coming out of European countries that are very small, very homogeneous. And that's when we discovered, I remember sitting across from a 7th grader, and he said to me, like, "Lady, I really love your questions. This is really exciting that you want to talk about bullying. But what you haven't talked about is something that we deal with every day, and that's being called homophobic slurs." And he said exactly the slurs. And he said, "Sometimes from my friends." And and I remember him saying, he's like, "I don't really even know who I like or what I like. Like, I like playing video games, but being called those names day in and day out really is taking a toll," essentially is what he said. And that's when we started looking at the literature and found in 2000 that there was a colleague in the UK that had been talking about homophobic bullying for a very long time, and that was in 2000. We then developed an actual tool called the Homophobic Content Agent Target Scale so that we could start to do the studies, see how prevalent this was. We actually found in 2005 and 2007 a series of studies that we did that showed bullying is a precursor to homophobic name calling, even among friends, even among kids that you think have different opinions about their sexual orientation. And we found that longitudinally, and we found it to be very, very strong among middle school years from grade 5 through 8. Fast forward, in 2008, we had a president in the White House that was pushing abstinence only sex education. And so that meant that Centers for Disease Control had a challenge of doing rape prevention in the schools. So what they started to do was implement bullying prevention programs instead of rape prevention education programs in our schools, with the hope that if we reduce bullying, that somehow this would address sexual violence and sexual harassment. As you can imagine, that was problematic because we didn't really have a research base. So CDC commissioned myself and others to write a paper on what do we know about the connection between bullying and sexual harassment. Well, at that point, there had been 5 papers written on it, one in Minnesota, one in California, and a couple in Brazil, that essentially showed that there might be an association. So we, for the last 13 years, have, if not more, put together a series of studies and argued for the bully sexual violence pathway. And I'll show you some evidence of that. We've also tried to incorporate gender enhanced social emotional learning and have focused on peer-led programs, which I'll highlight some of the work that we've done there. Fast forward to 2023, we were able to find beyond the 5 studies in 2023, there was a huge body of literature, much bigger, that we reviewed, and I'm going to give you some highlights of that. And then just this last year as well, we were able to extend the bully sexual violence pathway to teen dating violence. That's a lot, just to say that unfortunately, we're talking about it more, we have more research. What we need to do is to really think about how each one of us can implement this one-on-one with kids, your own kids, your community, and implement as much as we can in prevention programs where your culture and your context would support such things. So I'm going to show you this longitudinal study where we collected data from 2008 to 2013. And we've just replicated some of these findings in our 2016 to 2019 Colorado study. And so these findings are holding nicely. In this particular sample, we had 46% that identified as African American or Black, 32% white, about 3,500 kids that we tracked for 6 years from 5th grade till grade 11, grade 12 in high school. So in the research world, this is phenomenal that we were able to track these kids for so long, and we needed that to fully capture that bullying, sexual violence pathway. And there have been a number of studies that we've published, papers that we've published off of this, but we're going to hit the highlights here. What we did recognize, and we continue to, this was replicated in the Colorado trial as well, that about 12% of youth, in this sense, this is binary, where we're not allowed to ask other, in this particular study in 2008, 12% of both males and females engage in high rates of problematic behavior that look like bullying. And these are these kids that are engaging about 60 acts a month, so a couple times a day. So this isn't lifetime, this is in the last 30 days, and this is high rates, so 12%. However, when we take that same type criteria and we ask kids if they've directed homophobic name calling epithets towards others, and we ask about friends, someone you did not like, someone you thought was gay, we have 1 out of 3 boys doing this at high rates in the last month, and 1 out of 5 girls, because girls also police boys' masculinity. So the minute a boy steps out of that, what a boy is supposed to act, if that's the culture and climate in the schools, girls will also direct homophobic epithets towards them. So we've also found, and this is important because oftentimes people will say, oh, like back in the day of like, oh, they don't know what that means when they say that is so gay or no homo, because there was a period of time where boys might bro hug each other, but then they would immediately say no homo, sending a message of like, I'm not gay, I'm just giving you a bro hug. And that's publicly, they will do that. Oftentimes people will say, oh, that's just part of bullying. That's just part of the problematic behavior. They're separate. There are kids that engage in high rates of problematic behavior that looks like bullying, whether that's name calling, that is not of the homophobic nature, that will never go on to call people those names. That's just not in their repertoire, but they might spread rumors or they might physically intimidate another student. It's a different type of connection here that those kids that go on to engage in these homophobic name calling. So we don't want to just put them together from a research standpoint. So those early studies really showed that homophobic name calling is quite prevalent in middle school. And we've actually found that in 2022 as well. Youth who resort to some youth who resort to bully resort to homophobic name calling over time, but we know that there are what we call mediators or moderators, which we'll talk about. This research to date really does suggest that there has to be a discussion around the marginalization of gender nonconforming and lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth. Again, if you're in a climate and culture where you're able to talk about this. I'm situated in the state of North Carolina, where if youth want to use different pronouns than the pronoun that would be indicated on their roster, the teachers have to call home. So these are not conversations that I'm having with youth in the state of North Carolina, unless you have a really brave administrator. And this is happening all over the country. So I think we do also need to recognize that some of the things I'm recommending you're going to have to work around and be creative to create that connection with some of our youth as we wait out this climate that we're experiencing. So I don't want to be Pollyannish about that. It's real. Okay, but in these particular studies, and again, replicated in 2019, problematic behavior related to bullying was related to the engagement of sexual harassment over time, both across middle school and then at the end of high school. That homophobic teasing or name calling was also associated with sexual harassment over time. And this is controlling for what we call individual propensity towards this. So it's real. We've also found this very interesting, we have the harmful behavior of bullying that then can be associated longitudinally with this harmful behavior of homophobic name calling, which then sets the stage for sexual violence, harmful behaviors. I want you to pay particular attention to the bullying, harmful behaviors, to the homophobic victimization. So I might be engaging in bullying and directing that toward others. They come back to me and they call me a homophobic epithet. The best way for a middle school boy or girl to demonstrate, if that's the climate, that they are not gay, for example, when they have these comments coming toward them, is to publicly sexually harass someone of the opposite sex. You're sending the message that although you're calling me those names, I will put my hands on the person of the opposite sex so that you could stop calling. So there's no more question in mind. So oftentimes when I'm working with educators and parents and teachers, and I have big audiences, I will have them raise their hand. How many of you have children in I'll say public schools, because that's what I study, in middle school or high school, right? How many of you have daughters in middle school or high school in the United States? And I have them raise their hand. And I said, if you're feeling uncomfortable with potentially thinking that I am promoting a certain sexual orientation, I want you to know that if we do not reduce bullying and we do not address simply by saying we don't use homophobic language around here, then your daughter is at risk for being the target of sexual harassment, because this is the way that, for example, boys will demonstrate that they are not gay. And if you've ever talked to a middle school girl that has had a stranger put hands on them, it is damaging, it is hurtful, and it is long-term hurtful. So I encourage, if you're in that climate where this is not palatable for some folks, really look at it, the climate and culture that is giving permission for boys to put hands on girls in order to demonstrate and counteract homophobic name calling. Yes, absolutely. Yes, Linda. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. Certainly send me an email if I can be more powerful with that resonation, but I can feel it in an audience where she's like, oh, why is she talking about this? Is she promoting this? I'm not. I'm actually promoting a positive school climate for all youth that don't have to see someone being violated in that way. As I said, we have extended this to teen dating violence. So this is just a screenshot of this. The results showed here that gender-based biases, and here we looked at sexism, really can bolster those behaviors from bullying to teen dating violence. So we looked at gender norms and pressures to adhere to masculinity in particular was associated with engagement in these problematic behaviors in teen dating violence relationships. So in this particular paper, as well as others, we call for comprehensive sex ed to really talk about the different experiences in gender, understanding that these problematic behaviors are kind of rooted within gender inequities. And unfortunately, and I never blame the youth, because I think the youth are surrounded by messages on the television and in social media, and supposedly grown adults that are sending messages that it's okay to engage in these behaviors. Yes, I am sorry that many of you are a mother of a daughter, so I apologize for that, but I encourage you, take this PowerPoint, take it home, have this conversation. And I think a conversation goes a long way, recognizing this, because oftentimes our schools are not recognizing the very climate and culture that's happening right under their nose. This was the review, and we'll make sure this is be available for you for your weekend coffee drinking reading in your spare time. So this is what we've been unpacking in that particular paper, because it's well and good to say that there are these associations between these problematic behaviors, but so what? Okay. And you've already told me, Dorothy, that not every kid that engages in bullying problematic behavior go on to engage in these other forms of aggression. It's absolutely true. We do know that there's two, and we talk more of the article, there's really two moderators. And so what that means is that association between bullying and sexual violence depends on a third variable. and traditional masculinity. So if youth adopt this traditional masculinity ideology, meaning that boys don't cry, boys don't talk about emotion, um, boys are stoic, they talk about their sexual prowess. Now, when I say that about a middle school kids, oftentimes people are like, why is she talking about sexual prowess among middle school boys? I often talk about when I take research assistants, when we go out to schools, I have to say, can you dress a particular way? Because by the end of the day, sometimes the boys in middle school are often asking for the phone numbers of our college research assistants. So abandon this idea that they're not thinking about their sexual prowess, if you will. So if, in fact, the bullying in middle schools, those kids that engage in these high rates of behavior adopt this traditional masculinity, right? That I have to be stoic, I can't be emotional, I shouldn't show my feelings, I have to be aggressive and competitive. If they hold that, it predicts both sexual violence and teen dating violence years later, right? So this is amazing because we have talked about multiple masculinities dating back now 40, 50 years, right? How do we raise boys to understand that there are different ways of displaying your masculinity? And some of the prevention programs, like coaching boys into men, for example, uses coaches to talk to boys about how it is that their gender-based harassment and aggressive behavior is hurtful, and how it is that they can still feel masculine but not have to engage in those problematic behaviors. Not a surprise that this effect is stronger for males than females. Where we do see a little bit of a problematic association moderator is when we have girls that have been targets of sexually harmful behavior, yet they're dismissive of it because they don't know that it's sexual harassment. They haven't been taught to create the boundaries around their bodies. They will tolerate sexual violence, and they will tolerate violence within dating relationships. Again, it's stronger for males than females, but we also find in this case that simply talking to kids about their definition of sexual harassment, if you just ask them, is sexual harassment happening in the school? They will say, no, no, no. And then once they start telling stories about things that happen, and then they look at the definition, it is very clearly that they're experiencing sexual harassment. So again, we have federal legislation, Title IX, that's not just for girls in sport, but it is around the prevention and the intervention of sexual harassment in K through 12 settings. So we're 52 minutes into this, and hopefully there's something new you have learned so far in this webinar. So go ahead and share in the chat before we embark upon this last 30 minutes. Looks like they've got the YouTube streaming back up. The problem is often the school's administrative and SRO stance towards this topic. Yes, Angela, we have been trying to develop, when we have developed professional development for SROs. So if anyone's interested, it was funded by NIJ, it's free. Let me know if we can get those 2-year SROs. Unfortunately, SROs, although some of them come out of the police academy, the majority of them come out of sheriff's office, very limited training in working with children in general. And then you have other school police and SROs that are all there for the kids. So they're just awesome and the most best community partners that you could ever have. Okay, so some things that we're hearing here, high rates of suicide and LGBTQ, right? Surprising. And the need for services and support. And unfortunately, the YRBS data, the youth risk surveillance data for 7th through 12th graders in this country, so the highest rates of suicidality in general populations, but also 1 out of 2 of LGBTQ have attempted in the last year. Yes, more awareness about homophobic. Brendan has a question. I'm curious if there's been any research done comparing the difference in population cultures between coastal communities that predominantly military families may, no, there has not been. That would be a great study. Where most of the military connected research has been done in this space is Ron Astor's work, ASTOR, out at UCLA and USC. So they've looked at Camp Pendleton, and then military connected families in LA Unified. And they find very similar cause for concern. Oh, okay. So this is so great, Julie. The question is, how does this data cross to domestic violence? This is so fabulous that you asked that, because I started developing these hypotheses in 1993 when I was training as a PhD student in Indiana University, and I had court-referred couples that were in my practicum. And they were court-referred because of domestic violence. And it was often the case that it was a male and female, where the husband was the batterer. That's what we called it. So I apologize the word. And as opposed to him getting, individual work, the couple was mandated. And I found myself, and some of the male I would have issues with, but then some of them were quite charming. And and then I was doing some prison work at the same time. And I was like, oh, what is this about? And then I would, not to equate domestic violence batterers with bullies, but then I would interview middle school kids that would be identified as the kid that was engaging in these problematic behaviors, and everybody knew it. And then I found myself really enjoying the company of the seventh grader. And so I think there is a crossover there. That there are some kids that engage in problematic behaviors of bullying that are popular, that have high social capital, that have personalities that almost mirror some of those adults that we may work with. Fascinating question. Okay, hopefully we can capture all this, Chuck. So some great questions, and I'd love to be able to answer all of these, but I'm going to move on for the sake of time and my voice. But great, thank you for interacting. That was fun. Okay, so I wanted to just show you a few more, this was a recent paper that we did. We're really just trying to understand how it is that we can prevent teen dating violence. And so we did what was called a latent profile analysis here. We wanted to look at, we continue to see this emotion dysregulation in kids that are involved in teen dating violence relationships, that something could be minor, something related to jealousy, feeling as if you're not getting enough attention, and it would escalate to violence, is what we were hearing from some of our adolescents that we're dating. This sample here, we wanted to look at how anger regulation, depressive symptoms, impulsivity, and alcohol use predicted involvement in teen dating violence. And so we had a total of 1,500 of our 3,000 kids that reported they had been in a relationship. And so we wanted to look at the extent to which these three, anger regulation, depressive symptoms, impulsivity, and alcohol use, were driving this, because we can teach anger management, we can address depression. Impulsivity seems to be a challenge in most of our studies, but impulsivity, or the lack of emotion regulation, we can try to address. And certainly we're always concerned about the onset of alcohol use, but alcohol use among dating high school couples is extremely problematic, as you can imagine, because of the disinhibition that comes with it. And so fancy statistics, we're going to go right past that and just give you the highlights. So we did find a group. So just in generally, 36% of the sample, that 1,500, reported exhibiting teen dating violence at least once in the last year at wave 1. And then at wave 2, into the additional year, 52% reported exhibiting teen dating violence as a target, or the one engaging in those problematic behaviors. We also know that it's reciprocal in these teen dating relationships. We also know from our data that the more physical tends to be engaged, the more physical type of teen dating violence is reported by males actually engaging those more problematic behaviors were verbal and controlling behaviors by the females. But we found a group that teen dating violence behaviors were related with moderate levels of anger dysregulation, depression symptoms, and impulsivity. And so for those particular couples and those individuals within those couples, anger management, addressing the depression, which may be contributed to the lack of problem solving or conflict resolution within the relationship, and impulsivity seems to be driving that problematic behavior. We did find one group where it seemed to be driven by alcohol use, and not only their own alcohol use, but using alcohol together. And if you combine that with some of the college couple studies that are out there, that where they've done daily diaries, and they found that as the couples, say in college, use substances together, the verbal aggression will increase on the part of, and again, these are heterosexual couples, on the part of the female counterpart, which then contributes to escalation of physical problematic behavior on the male part. We're concerned about that because when physicality comes into play by the male couple, we know that there's more likely to be injury and hospitalization. So understanding that really anger management, addressing the depression and the impulsivity, but recognizing if there's alcohol present, we're very, very concerned about that escalating to injury. So overall, for teen dating violence prevention efforts, we have to consider the differences of the onset and the stability of these risk factors over time. We're always concerned about any use of substances. The onset during middle school, it is clear from the research, if we could get our adolescents to not use any substances until their brain is developed at 25, that would be awesome. But if we can just defer that onset, it seems to be protective against not only bullying, but also teen dating violence involvement. It is clear that the teen dating violence prevention programs could benefit from those same social emotional learning competencies, but also substance use education. We know that programs like Fourth R, that's out there, addresses teen dating violence, but it also hits on substance use and healthy relationship skills and conflict management skills, because we do know for the adolescents that are experiencing violence, they may not have the coping strategies or the conflict management skills to de-escalate conflicts that could go on to become very, very serious and result in an injury. And that's what we want to prevent. We think that the teen dating violence prevention should be inclusive and representative of all the relationships that kids may have. Again, culture context makes a difference here. Risk factors at all those socioecological levels must be studied. And that's what we started with today, right? So we could actually take that socioecological perspective from the beginning and also argue that this is important when we think about comprehensive violence prevention for all youth. That said, there have been 2 OneUp webinars that we want to call attention to here. This first one is called Providing Affirmative Care to the LGBTQ Military Community. So just great. This is a webinar that I ended up reviewing last week, just brilliantly done. It focuses on those continuums of identity, sexual orientation, gender identity, biological sex, gender expression. And so if you really want to understand all those nuances, this is a great, fabulous webinar. But looking at some of the things we've already talked about, the impact of that discrimination, what are the relevant healthcare disparities and ways to encourage a welcoming care environment for all? And I pay attention to this very closely, that when we have this discrimination toward other social identities, it impacts the entire community, as we all know, but really putting that in the front of your mind, that it's not we're calling attention to these identities, we're calling attention to identities so that everyone can feel supported in our community. The second one focuses on applying affirmative, evidence-based best practices for care delivery for transgender and gender diverse adults in the military community. And this doesn't address the adolescents, but does give you some indication of what are best practices within this context when we think about gender diverse and transgender military community. Applauds the OneOp team for having these webinars, just brilliant. And I assign them in my class. So very, very excited for the work that you're doing there. We've talked a lot about the risk factors and the fact that, we've got this trajectory, but I also want to pay attention to the focus on protective factors. And Centers for Disease Control and other federal agencies, as well as the military, is really trying to take this framing of a strength-based approach. And so we have papers on that. And we have a number of papers, but I want to highlight a few things. What I show here is these kids that we tracked from 5th grade into high school. So this is what the lines are going to show. And the top line are those females that do not engage in teen dating violence at all. And what you note for them in the empathy is that they're high in empathy in 5th grade and they remain high, right? So seems to be protective that if you have an understanding of others and you're have a concern for others and you're caring, that seems to be that you're not going to be involved in teen dating violence. And these are those that are engaging in problematic behaviors toward their dating partner. So we're not looking at victimization. We're actually looking at those that are engaging those problematic behaviors. Go down to the second line here, and what we see are those males that are not engaging in these behaviors, right? So they are still high on that empathy, lower than the females, but there. We then go to those females that engage in these problematic behaviors toward a dating partner. Their empathy is low to start, although catches up. So there's something about those young ladies, if you will, that their empathy is increasing, but never gets as high as those kids that are not involved. And then cause for concern are those males, that last line that shows that they have the lowest empathy in late elementary school, early middle school. And although they increase over time, they do not increase to the same level. And these are the males that are engaged in this problematic behavior toward their dating partner. This really points to the need to address these differences in empathy and perspective taking in late elementary school. Not that you have to address teen dating violence in 5th grade, but can we continue to promote social emotional learning where we do move the needle on empathy? And that might be setting up protections as these youth then go into high school that may start dating, right? Very similar pattern on the right for school belonging. And so concern here that those kids that are engaged in these problematic behaviors have the lowest school connectedness starting in late elementary school. And although the females that engage in these behaviors catch up over time, the males do not necessarily. I will also add that we, in every single one of our 30 studies that we've done over the last 30 years, whether it's looking at exposure to all of the ACEs and outcomes for youth, school belonging, school connectedness, positive school climate continues to show up as a protective factor. Now, for me, this is brilliant because I was the military kid that was moving school to school. And my goal always, I was not a scientist when I was in elementary school or middle school, but it was very, very clear that my own mental health hinged on how I would connect in that school, which teacher I would connect to. Right. And so, unlike my siblings that didn't have that worldview or that mission in mind, they did not do as well with all of the transitions. And it could be that I had that personality and I was attractive, right? We all know all the resilient characteristics that teachers resonated toward me, whatever it was. But every time I find this finding, I just want to tear up because we may not be able to change all of the ills of society. We may not be able to change the parenting styles, the lack of supervision, the violence that our families might be exposed to. but we can sure reduce the likely of negative outcomes by doing the right thing of making sure every kid is connected to a single adult in the building and that they have someone to talk to and they want to go to school, right? So I think for so many kids that are military connected and military families, school could be a really great place for us to overcome some of those adverse childhood experiences in general. Yes. So the question here from Tina, were students with disability part of the research? Yes, we have a whole nother 50 papers on bullying among students with disabilities. We know that it's a high rate there. They also experience sexual violence. We know less about their teen dating violence relationships, as we tend to not study that, unfortunately. But we do have so I will make sure that we get some resources. Some students with disabilities also identify. Yes, we have a few papers, what we call intersectionality, and where we've looked at not only race interacting with gender and sexual minority status, as well as disabilities. And as you have more of these identities, the risk for bullying and sexual violence, and we might have one paper on teen dating violence, actually is compounded over time. However, school continues to be a protective factor for even those that identify with these intersecting identities. Yes, great question. Which study? So this study, these graphs come from our longitudinal study, the middle school through high school study that I've been referring to throughout the presentation. Okay. All right, so we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to kind of fly through some of these slides, but again, you'll have the PowerPoint to refer to. So the takeaway messages is that empathy, I didn't show parental monitoring, but parental monitoring continues to be a protective factor for all of our youth across all of America. Know where your kids are, know who their friends are, be that irritating parent. They'll appreciate that as they age. Trust me, they will. Social support was also a predictor of all forms. So we really do need to think about implementing prevention programs in middle school that focus on teaching empathy, promoting parental involvement and support. And we also talk about parental disclosure, but that's a whole nother discussion around social media. Promoting that school connectedness, increasing social support. That will set the stage for when our youth go on to start dating, to have those skills in place to manage conflicts that are going to be inevitable within dating relationships. We really do need to have a comprehensive approach that addresses the climate. I've talked a lot about there's a climate where some of these harmful behaviors are not recognized, may be underreported, because as these problematic behaviors of bullying are not reported, that we're giving kids the I guess, permission to engage in these behaviors by not intervening. It sets the stage for these problematic sexual behaviors later in life. We have to also think about counteracting these perceptions of gender nonconformity over time. Yeah, so really considering these multiple contexts from a researcher standpoint, these mediators and moderators, there's not direct effects, but understanding who are those kids that go on to engage in these escalated problematic behaviors, and why do some kids not? And clearly empathy and social support, parental monitoring play into that. So what are some characteristics of effective programs? So we've been trying to develop programs to address both bullying and sexual violence, and we've had some success. So I refer you back to the webinar 1, where we talked about our social emotional learning program, large evaluations that showed that simply implementing social emotional learning programs with fidelity as intended can reduce not only bullying, but sexual violence as well as teen dating violence. So overall, what do we think about this? Well, they have to involve leadership of the community members. There has to be enough, what I would say, dosage programming to actually resonate with the kids. We have to give kids interpersonal skills. This is oh so important post-COVID. We're finding in the research that kids have regressed somewhat in their social skills and interpersonal skills. We could argue that some of us have too. I don't know. that we really need to have a hypervigilance around teaching these interpersonal skills. Again, if you're allowed to teach these things in the practices that you do. We need to continue to chase after bystander approaches. We know that 60% of kids are not involved in these problematic behaviors, but they're witnessing, and some are standing around doing nothing. Again, I refer you to webinar 1 to really get to the nuts and bolts around the importance of bystanders stepping in. Have to be multi-level strategies, and also thinking about the role of oppression and discrimination and racism towards certain identities. Multi-level strategies I can unpack. So we have to support the youth that are exposed to the violence, those victims, if you will. Engage the youth as leaders and influencers. Again, referring back to my first webinar, it is very, very clear that our violence prevention efforts, we do very well up until grade 6 or 7. And then the kids kind of just tune out. What we've learned is that we have to bring the youth to the table. They know what's happening in the schools. They are the ones oftentimes being silent about the experiences that their peers and themselves are experiencing. Bring them to the table. They have good ideas. They know more about the school climate and culture than many of the adults do that are really just trying to get through the day. How do we create safer and more welcoming schools? I'm going to show this example here, which you have the resource. Please go to www.safeaustin.org. This is an association that has been working for a long time to address, it goes back all the way to 1997, if not earlier, with the work of Barry Rosenbluth. That includes support groups for those kids involved, individual counselings for those that need really individual work. Theater performance is to raise the awareness, having youth leadership training so that youth that are experiencing these types of dating issues in 2023 and 2024 can really demonstrate ways in which to raise the awareness, but also moving that beyond to prevention efforts. Creating a diverse team that, again, involve community members, all the stakeholders, because the idea is that we don't want to just come in and do these programs, but we want sustainable programs. This is just an example, Expect Respect, been working on for decades at safeaustin.org that really focuses on developing connections in group, defining personal expectations for relationships, making sense of your life story, learning skills for those healthy relationships, and strengthening your support system, right? Oftentimes, intimate partner violence, very similar to teen dating violence. There's a sense of isolation and the stripping of those support systems, as you know. And so these are conversations that they would have in grades 6 through 12. There's 24 sessions, and again, we have links to all of this. The youth influencers and bystander approaches. This is all about social campaigning and running and using the voice of the youth to develop all of these campaigns. And engaging in arts and theater to spread the message that can be very heavy, right? So I encourage you to check those websites out and the links. These are just some of our poster campaigns, social media campaigns that the youth have worked on with Barry Ruthenbluth's team out there in Texas, as well as other places across the country. It's really been a model for some of this addressing that bullying to sexual violence to teen dating violence link. So taking research that we've talked about here, but really addressing sexual harassment, consent, and knowing your rights, because oftentimes most of our schools are not teaching children around their rights of Title IX as they should be doing. Okay, as I said, multi-level, so long-term approach, relationship building. CDC talks about preventing teen dating violence, which is required at the individual level. So learning attitudes and behaviors, relationship, community, and society. So we're kind of full circle when we think about this over time. It has to be highly collaborative, inclusive. You have to have local champions. And just recognize that it's going to be difficult to evaluate, but there's nothing like sitting down with kids that are involved and asking them about how their lives have changed, their worldviews, the ways in which they think about relationships. We did want to call attention to this really does resonate and align with the military family readiness system. And the role of the MFRS is to link informal networks like the families, the friends, and the neighbors with formal networks of schools, faith-based organizations, which are great. We're working with churches more than ever in the teen dating violence space because of the difficulties of the conversation. You'd be surprised at how many clergy and pastors see this in their community as a need, and so continue to really optimizing service to be ready and the families ready. And so where do we go from here? I've got 2 minutes to wrap this up. So we've done a lot of work of looking at this developmental cascade of these, what we call dominance-oriented aggressive behaviors. We've talked quite a bit about this bullying to sexual violence, teen dating violence pathway. The research is there, the evidence is there. How do we interrupt it? We need to think about really deploying the prevention programs to talk about those dominance behaviors and how they're rewarded. And we want to talk about fostering a culture where they're not rewarded, where we have collective care, empathy, and psychoeducation. Recognizing in your own youth that you work with or your children yourselves, we can see very young in our own children, right? Preschool and kindergarten, where they might dominate and when they're playing school or whatever. Just notice the importance of that dominance. That dominance can manifest itself into popularity, where some of those kids that are popular may engage in these problematic behaviors over time. Educators also, first and foremost, need to hear this webinar. They need to understand what's underlying some of this problematic behavior. And so bringing that awareness, which I often do here in the School of Education, to the teachers and generally doing these webinars as well. It's important to understand that peers will support some of these behaviors. They may contribute to the problematic behavior, but we also have kids that are standing around that are not doing anything to stop it for fear of being the problematic behavior then being directed at them. How do we give them the agency? How do we create a climate and culture where intervening is promoted and is modeled by adults as well? We also need to think about the use of substances and relationships, and focus on that skills training over time. All right, so some suggestions that are obvious, I hope, that I have sprinkled throughout. So as service providers, we need to model healthy relationships and promote open communications about these various topics that might be taboo, right? And the kids would appreciate it. The youth would appreciate you bringing up these conversations as part of their life. Focus on the strategies connect during those school. That school belonging is so strong. So think about that. Implement strategies that are strength-based, right? Focusing on the skills and active coping. I could have gone and on about engaging parents. It's critical for parents to understand. You as parents here, go talk to your kids tonight about what you've learned, what upset you, what causes you some concern. Have a conversation with them. Direct conversations, and use me of like, oh, this lady was talking about this today. What do you think about this? Youth should be encouraged to disclose experiences. The first conversation is you having that with your child, but then say, okay, they might be saying it's not happening to me, but my friend has experiences. Well, what happened? Why aren't they talking? Talk to them the barriers about disclosing. And again, I'll hit that again. How is it that we can make this transition to a new school encouraging and really connecting them? And then understanding that parents need to ramp up the monitoring, especially with the influx of social media and other influences that they might not be monitoring. Know exactly who they're hanging out with, what space they're hanging out with over time. So one last question here is, what one thing you can do to integrate preventative strategies into your clinical practice when working with children and youth based on this webinar? What is one thing you can do? And I'm going to hand it over. Thank you very much for taking the time today to hear me talk about all this wonderful work we're trying to do.
Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you, Dr. Espelage. That was a very, very wonderful, wonderful session. It looks like we do have one question, so maybe we can get to that really quickly. We have a few more minutes. Outside of the first webinar, is there any specific resources that you would recommend for the around being a bystander? And I do want to note that I know Sesame Street and Communities, they have some really great resources around being bystander and upstander. So I will note those, and then I will throw it to you to see if you have any, Dr. Espelage, to wrap things up.
Yeah, that's wonderful that you've mentioned them. I would say also Nickelodeon. And then, Kaylin, I'm not sure if we've put the stopbullying.gov website. on the
That
resources?
Not for
Yeah?
the second one. That is
Okay,
linked for folks, though. That is linked on the first webinar slides. So that is
okay.
available for y'all there.
Yeah, so keep that in mind. Stopbullying.gov. It's the federal partnerships from all the federal agencies that came together to address bullying, and they have quite just wonderful resources. So we'll make sure that that's in this slide deck as well. Thank you for the question.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dorothy. Dr. Espelage. So yes, to Dr. Espelage's point and a lot of stuff she talked about throughout the session, we did want to highlight some OneOp resources here. We do have a series around sexual behavior in children and youth series, and we also have a few courses within that series, and a couple of those courses actually really comprehensively go into engaging parents as well as parental monitoring, and a lot of that does focus, of course, on technology now, because we know that is a big piece of what that looks like for our kiddos and our youth now. So we really encourage you to check that out if you have not already. A lot of that is around children who have exhibited those behaviors, but a lot of those resources and content that we provide can be utilized in the prevention arena as well. And then, of course, we also have our military youth protecting and promoting resilience and well-being, and that really focuses a lot on best practice applications that you can utilize in schools and in your work with kids around social emotional learning and development. And then again, all of the resources that Dr. Espelage mentioned throughout today's session, as well as a comprehensive list of her research and work and articles, can be found on the webinar event page for today. And again, all of these resources are linked. And moving forward for folks, now that we are at the conclusion of today's session, if you are hoping to get continuing education credits, I will be covering that information next. The link to the evaluation is available on the event page. That link to the evaluation will take you on to getting your CE credit for today. When you visit the event page, you will see the purple button like the one on the screen. Please click that and it will take you to the evaluation and then to a list of CE credit options, and it will direct you to the appropriate links from there, depending on what CE credit hour you hope to obtain today. If you do not see this button, especially if you had the page open since the beginning of the webinar, please refresh the event page or exit out and reload the event page, and you should be seeing that link. It is added throughout the webinar, so you may not see that if you've had the slides page up since the beginning. Your feedback is very important to us, so we do ask you to take a short evaluation, letting us know your thoughts on today's webinar, and then you will be directed to the post-test options and CE options. The list of CEs offered are noted on the event on the screen right now, as well as on the event page. If you have any questions or issues obtaining that certificate, please email us at ce@oneop.org. If this is your first time taking a credit hour with us, we highly recommend you giving it about 1 to 2 days to go through your email. And please check your spam folder as well if you believe you should receive that certificate and have not yet. If you've done that and you still don't have your certificate, please email us and one of our team will make sure that you get that CE certificate for your hours spent on today's webinar. We invite you to join us for our next webinar on Wednesday, March the 27th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. That will be Mind and Money, Connecting Mental Health and Financial Well-Being. This presentation will define personal and family financial well-being. Participants will understand the intersection between financial well-being and mental well-being, including financial strains and the impacts of that stress on mental health. Participants will also identify financial counseling and therapy modalities and practices, and will be able to describe financial therapy. CE credits will be available for participants for that session, and you can RSVP now and mark your calendar on the event page for that webinar. We invite you to connect with us on social media as well as visit our website. We have a lot of supportive resources around conversations that we mentioned today, as well as other resources that we share daily on our social media and such. So please follow us there if you do not already. And again, thank you all so much. We had some really, really great engagement in today's session, and we hope to see you in a future webinar. And again, if you have any issues at all, please refer to the slide deck for our contact information and reach out to us. Thank you all so much for attending today. And thank you so much, Dr. Espelage, for your time in both this session and the first session last month that we had you join us. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us. And all the resources should be linked on the event page. And we hope to see you in a future webinar soon. Thank you all so much.